event. Radio Algeria International, our voice in the world.
This is the English service of Radio Algeria International. It's time for the news.
Good afternoon. For the English special bulletin, 313 Palestinians lost their lives during the ongoing Israeli aggression against the people of Gaza, with an additional 7 victims in the West Bank during the past 24 hours. And members of the UN Security Council are meeting for closed-door urgent consultations on the Palestinian issue in the wake of the Zionist escalation against the occupied Palestinian territories, particularly in Gaza. And Palestinian Authority called for an emergency Arab League meeting at the foreign ministerial level. The request for the meeting comes in light of the brutal and ongoing Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people. And Algeria has expressed its deep concern over the escalation of the barbaric Zionist attacks against the Gaza Strip, which have cost the lives of 313 Palestinians, calling on the international community to intervene immediately to protect the Palestinian people against the Zionist brutality and criminality. The Algerian Foreign Ministry said Algeria vigorously condemns these policies and practices which go against the most basic human rules and international legality. And Algeria is celebrating today the National Day of Diplomacy that coincides with October 8th. Each year, the national diplomacy, which is marked by a strong return to the international arena thanks to the great importance granted to it by the Algerian state, headed by the President of the Republic, Abdelmadjid Tebboune. On the occasion, the Algerian National Radio is organizing today a common theme devoted to this subject. So now, a special program dedicated to Algeria's diplomacy. Born in the midst of the War of Liberation and experienced in conflict resolution, Algerian diplomacy, which celebrates its National Day on October 8, continues today to play a determining role alongside the international community for a world of peace, stability and security. With its leading figures, Algerian diplomacy signed its birth certificate in Bandung, Indonesia in April 1955 to make known the voice of Algeria and the fight of Algerian people for their freedom and independence in international fora. This strategy quickly paid off, given that the Algerian cause was included in the agenda of the UN General Assembly in the fall of 1955. The year 1958 marked the official introduction of the Provisional Government of the Algerian Republic, GPRA, on the UN scene with a draft resolution under which the General Assembly recognized the right of Algerian people to independence while taking note of the GPRA's willingness to enter into negotiations with the French government. This success was made possible thanks in particular to the efforts of the representative of the National Liberation Front in America, Mohamed Yazid. The efforts of Algerian diplomacy eventually bore fruit with the organization of a self-determination referendum in 1962 with independence after 130 years of colonization. The success of Algerian diplomacy continued after the country's independence. In 1974, Algeria chaired the UN General Assembly and invited former Palestinian President, late Yasser Arafat, to deliver his historic speech at the United Nations, thus marking a decisive turning point in the struggle of the Palestinian people against the Israeli occupier. This decision opens the door to the successive participation of Palestinian representatives in all United Nations debates at different UN bodies. Algerian diplomacy was also insightful and effective in one of the most terrible hostage situations of the 20th century, that of American diplomats in Iran. It was thanks to the efficiency of Algerian diplomacy that this hostage taking ended happily in 1981. In his statement at the 78th UN General Assembly held last month in New York, President of the Republic Abdelmadjid Tebboune said Algeria will continue its efforts to change the historic injustices against the African continent and the oppressed people fighting for their freedom. Pointing to his government in favor of the Palestinian people's right to establish an independent state, he called on the Council to adopt a resolution that favors the two-state solution and end the unilateral practices of the occupying authority, including the settlement on the Palestinian territory.
كما أدعو من هذا المنبر مجلس الأمن إلى إصدار قرار يؤكد بموجبه حماية الحل الدولتين التي يحظى بإجماع دولي ووقف الأعمال أحادية الجانب للسلطة القائمة على الاحتلال وعلى رأسها الأنشطة الاستيطانية في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة، مع تجديد المطالبة وألح على ذلك تجديد المطالبة بعقد جمعية عامة استثنائية لمنح دولة فلسطين العضوية الكاملة فيها. وأكرر مع تجديد المطالبة بعقد جمعية عامة استثنائية لمنح دولة فلسطين العضوية الكاملة في الجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة.
The president said Algeria's diplomacy is closely following events in neighboring nations to find peaceful solutions. He supported the United Nations' efforts to find a Libyan-led political solution to the crisis. And on Mali, he said Algeria is playing a leading role in efforts to overcome obstacles to peace and stressed that force must be avoided. He urged a return to the constitutional order in Niger through peaceful means and respect for the rule of law, warning that foreign military intervention could have dangerous repercussions for the region as a whole. And Algeria's mediation was later accepted following the July 26 coup.
بالنسبة لوضع المستجد في الجار النيجر، فالجزائر تؤكد تمسكها بالعودة إلى النظام الدستوري بالطرق السلمية وتغليب الحلول السياسية والدبلوماسية واحترام متطلبات دولة القانون، وتدعو إلى توخي الحذر أمام نوايا التدخل العسكري الأجنبي لما له من عواقب خطيرة على أمن واستقرار النيجر والمنطقة كلها.
The president also spoke in favor of the Sahrawi people's fight for independence and reiterated Algeria's constant support for the recovery of their right to self-determination.
ونتطلع إلى الوصول إلى تصفية نهائية لظاهرة الاستعمار مع آخر مستعمرة إفريقية، حيث لا زال الشعب بأكمله في الصحراء الغربية محروما من حقه الأساسي في تقرير المصير عبر استفتاء حر ونزيه يتوافق مع خطة التسوية الأممية الإفريقية التي اعتمدها مجلس الأمن سنة 1991 ووافق عليها الطرفان والتي تظل تنتظر التطبيق.
Algerian diplomacy chief highlighted that despite its firm positions in favor of the different causes and peaceful solutions, Algeria is aware of the current world challenges, notably regional and international security challenges, stressing that they require more solidarity from the international community and the respect of the state's territorial integrity. And still with national diplomacy, here is an interview conducted by Mohamed Khatel with Maghreb Studies researcher Abdel Nour Toumi.
Algerian diplomacy, which is committed to the principles of the 1st of November 1954 and which has always backed just causes and the people's right to self-determination and independence, has marked a strong return on the international scene through its contribution to the settlement of crises in the region and the establishment of peace. Algeria has participated through its diplomacy in the settlement of several crises, like that of the American hostages in Iran, settlement of the conflict between this country and Iraq in 1975, and also the crisis of hijacking of Kuwaiti plan in 1988, and more recently in the crises in Niger, Libya, in addition to the Palestinian and Sahrawi issues. So, to speak about that aspect, I invite today the Algerian political analyst, Mr. Abdel Nour Toumi, who is Maghreb Studies researcher at Orson Center in Ankara, Turkey. Mr. Abdel Nour Toumi, welcome.
Good morning, sir, and thank you for having me on the show.
You're welcome. So, Mr. Toumi, to start off, so could you tell us a little bit of background and history about Algerian diplomacy?
Indeed, actually, as one would describe diplomacy in general, diplomacy often refers to the established peaceful relationship between states. But in modern time or postmodern time, diplomacy has been changing and also following the imperatives and the dynamic of the world order. Now, as far as Algeria's diplomacy goes, it is indeed has a solid history and legacy. And I heard you mention that in your opening statement, going to the sacrosanct communique of November 1954, so in which was launched a large and just liberation war against harsh colonization and acculturation process that Algerian nation and people went through for more than a century. At that moment, during the war, and indeed the French authorities, civilians and military alike, didn't want to see that happen. And also they portrayed the question as non-order issue rather than a war of liberation from an unjust colonizer. So Algerian leaders at that time did launch and actually were having kind of a parallel action, military and the political action going simultaneously. Mm-hmm. On the political branch or field, they had, of course, established diplomacy, and then we saw how they succeeded, the leaders then, to put the Algerian cause in front and take it to the General Assembly at the UN, and also that was very smart. They had an echo, and we saw that in Bandung conference in Indonesia also. And then we saw how the art of diplomacy that was managed and orchestrated by the leaders. We saw even sports diplomacy, and then was so and so the FLN team of the soccer team, how they were the first ambassadors of the modern Algeria state, across the world, and how they showed the real picture of this nation and people that have a solid millennium cultural background. So this is to sum up all the historic perspective, and sure there are some chronology going on after the independence and how Algeria diplomacy did play a huge role in the decolonization process and helping the people for self-determination and starting, with then it's a long list, but I will stop on the 1974, the speech of President Boumediene at the UN General Assembly, and how he excelled to bring the Palestinian cause and put it in front, and also speaking about then a new economical order, and how Algeria also, position was very, very strong, and how they, again, in 1975, how President Boumediene did bring together the Iraqis and the Iranians to sign Algiers Accord in 1975. And then there are, of course, some, some elements go into that.
Yeah, of course. So this is about history, and more recently, so the Algerian diplomacy has made a lot of achievements, particularly with the peace and reconciliation agreement that stemmed from the Algiers process to resolve the crisis in Mali, the many efforts undertaken to solve the crisis in Libya, in addition to the unification of the Palestinian factions ranks as part of the Arab Summit that was held here in Algiers, and more recently the mediation of Algeria, which was accepted by the authorities in Niger to mediate and solve the crisis in this neighboring country. So this is yet evidence of the efficiency of the Algerian diplomacy. So how do you think the Algerian diplomacy is perceived by the countries of the world in this sense?
I mean, it is true. I mean, as I stated, and this is why I thought on the year of 1975 actually was a shift in Algerian policy and how Algeria positioned itself in that posture of the Cold War, of, again, insecurity and uncertainty that were shaping the world order. I mean, it looks pretty much as if the turmoil that we are going through nowadays. And Algeria so had that credibility and also, I mean, it demonstrated itself. I mean, Algerian leaders, and this is because of the huge skills of its diplomats who played an extraordinary role, and these diplomats put Algerian diplomacy and having that independency and also having a doctrine back then already had, Algeria had a doctrine of positive non-alignment and independency. So then it was credible voice for any mediation or reconciliation. And then we saw that in the 1979 U.S.-Iran diplomat hostage crisis, and how Algeria also played a major role to break through that crisis. And then after that, in 1982, 1881 and 82. I mean, and then that's the mediation between Algeria, the mediation of Algeria that again positioned itself to mediate between Iran and Iraq, and unfortunately ended up with a tragedy with the loss of Algerian Foreign Minister Mohammed Salah bin Yahya, rahimahullah. And then later, of course, there is another step where Algeria played a major role in the Lebanese crisis, and that ended the civil war, and that led by the Taif Accord in 1989, in which led to kind of, I would say, a gap for decades, and that's what because of some political reasons, internal political reasons, until 2000, when Algeria did also play a role of reconciliation by breaking through to the crisis between Eritrea and Ethiopia. But Algeria didn't back up. To the contrary, it did react, I mean, with a new foreign policy doctrine. It will be based on preemptive action and also pragmatism. So in which led to the role that played in Mali, and that which brings the Malians to have that Algiers Accord, that it is still fragile, but it is a good roadmap that the Malians are following it. And nonetheless, these days we are hearing about some problems going on. So on the Libyan issue, Algeria also did have kind of prudent position, and then popped in following some national security questions that Algeria was indeed concerned, and it was an imminent threat to its national security, because in the end of the day, Algeria doesn't want to see Libya or Mali or Niger to turn into failed state or a militia state. To the contrary, Algeria would play a major role to have the stability and the development for this. So now, if I may, as far as the Algerian mediation in Niger, it's a great initiative, and also Algerian diplomacy had shown its strength and also its say, I would say, its word that I am a major player in the region, and because for many reasons, and notably it's a national security issue, and Algeria, as I said, won't let the Niger or Mali to fall into a failed state or militia state.
Absolutely. So, Mr. Abdel Nourtoumi, Algerian diplomacy is confronted with many challenges and difficulties, not only due to the heavy burden that it's put on its shoulders, but also due to the obstacles put by some agendas, lobbies, and countries which don't want to see Algeria play this major role. So, can you develop on this, please?
Sure. I mean, Algeria, because of its position, strategic position, geostrategic and geoeconomic position in the region, and of course, is again a solid country, pivotal state, a rising state. I would argue on that. It's a rising state and having again a say. So there are many factors. Obstacles. Actually, some even when mentioned by destabilization factors, either non-state elements and some states, unfortunately, elements who sometimes believe or let Algiers believe that are friends, but unfortunately, they are. They have been acting as obstructionists for any Algerian position just to destabilize Algeria or put Algiers on the panic mode, which unfortunately wouldn't happen because so far Algerian diplomats and Algerian authorities in general, military and civilians alike, have been showing their concern and also their determination on the issue of national security and the stability of the region and the sub-regional order. So it's obvious now to see all the regional power or rising states who are also trying to, again, destabilize Algeria because they know its role and they know, its determination and how Algeria has been actually playing a role of stability and security in the region and eventually prosperity for the entire region. And this is the main goal of any foreign policy determinations. Of course, UN has to look to its national interest, but national interest, economic interest, and of course national security issues. But there are also other elements that would put or bring other actors together for stability, security, and prosperity. An interesting element here, actually, unfortunately, one wishes to have this integral process that would all the sub-regional order to work together. By this, the Maghreb Union, which is unfortunately is dead. The Arab League, has not been playing its role as supposed to be, again, because of the differences that unfortunately shaping the narrative of unity as a whole.
So my following question, Mr. Abdel Nourtoumi, is that Algeria's diplomacy or Algerian diplomacy has always been active, but was even more boosted under the chairmanship of the President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmadjid Tebboune, who attaches a paramount importance to diplomacy. So what are some actions and decisions taken by the President of the Republic in this regard?
Actually, indeed. You mentioned the noun active, and also this is one of the determinant of the Algerian new foreign policy doctrine is based on preemptive and active diplomacy. And we saw this activism, actually positive activism, that has been put in place, and this is due to the tandem that started between President Abdelmadjid Tebboune and then his Foreign Affairs Minister, Mr. Lamamra, who did again play a major role in this new foreign policy, and now is continuing by the current Foreign Affairs Minister, Mr. Ahmed Attaf, who is doing an excellent job because of his skills and his background. And I think this team did understand the challenge and also the historical and the geopolitical role that Algeria needs to be and to play, and it doesn't want to leave any vacuum, any power vacuum for any other so and so new actors, foreign actors that would fill in this power vacuum, and in light of this power cycle that has been going on now for quite time in the region. And we all know and understand, whether it's sub-regional or regional order, it's a question of sphere of influence and also of interest. So Algeria also wants to, is sending a strong message to all these I would say, interested actors that indeed if one wants to deal or to be in this, has to deal with me directly, and I have to say in it. So therefore, Algerian diplomacy has been active and is so far is doing an excellent job. And we saw that how the late crisis in Niger, how Algeria did manage it very, very well, and to some extent did even stop a suicidal move that was portrayed by France and its allies, the sub-regional ECOWAS. And again, Algeria did excel to bring an important actor, its superpower, by this, Washington, to ally on its position and share Algeria's position on Niger crisis. So this is why now, for Algeria has to look for step forward.
Okay. So to conclude this interview, Mr. Toumi, so how do you see the future of Algerian diplomacy?
Again, as I stated earlier, diplomacy is an art, and this art needs to be taken by real competent diplomats, because again, diplomacy at the end of the day needs competent diplomats. Meaning by this, and Algeria's diplomacy school is very, very rich on that, and we have international names that did, show their skills and competence, worldwide. We don't have time to cite names, and I don't want to cite names. To miss anybody, or to be unfair to some names, but it is true. But also, which is important here, we have, when you say by the we, I put this pronoun between brackets, and the authorities need to look for other options. They don't have to stop or to focus only on the Ivy school, like Lina, for instance, to bring the diplomats and so on. Sure, they are competent and skillful public servants, but now they need to look at, to create think tanks and also, why not an academy of diplomacy, and also to encourage more public diplomacy. Meaning by this, it's like, sports diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, and even try to open up to civil society actors, NGOs, and so on, because now we saw how the world is changing, and all the imperatives that we had known 50 years ago, we can once say, are no longer valid. So today, and we saw crisis, humanitarian crisis, catastrophe, Mother Nature crisis. So we need to have this, to take these elements into consideration, and why not have this humanitarian diplomacy that will shape Algerian foreign policy and put it in front, because Algeria is a solid and pivotal state and a rising state in the region. Therefore, it has to be strong and have say in this turmoil world order that we are hearing about and we will be seeing in the future. And Algeria actually needs to be independent and doesn't have to focus on how to join these integral groups here and there. It has to look for multilateral relations and diversification of its economy and foreign policy as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abdenour Toumi. So I recall that you are a Maghreb studies researcher at Orson Center in Ankara, Turkey. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for this rich debate.
Thank